we have to address the fact that even people who are in privileged positions are being harmed by this system, right? The idea is that no one is benefiting from this system of hegemonic masculinity. Certainly not the people who are marginalized and oppressed by it, right? Women and quote unquote othered men. But also that the men at the top are not, going to be in a healthy headspace as long as they see themselves as having to maintain this type of masculinity to do so. So again, it's a sort of paradox. Even though men benefit greatly, right, a certain type of man in this case, from this institutional power, they may not necessarily feel empowered. And I think, you can think of a lot of maybe one political example right now that is a perfect demonstration of that, right? So someone who maybe performs in an overly confident fashion in such a way that it actually is more of a sign of their insecurity, right? Constantly needing that gratification, constantly needing to be praised. Okay, so how can we affect this, and how can we create change? Right? Well, of course, that hegemonic system creates a desire and an insurmountable need to be viewed as masculine, which, as we've seen through some examples, and I'm sure you can think of more, affect all areas of society. So we don't want to just try to escape, right, if we don't fit in, or exclude those who don't fit in, right? This sort of escapist and exclusionary behavior, according to Kimmel, is often used by men to keep and or regain power, right? So the idea is that if you are experiencing any sort of privilege, you will want to maintain that privilege by excluding others, right? Because again, you might be seeing that as them taking something away from you. Or if you can't deal with the emotional and psychological toll of what it takes to be in that position, you might engage in forms of escapism, right? Through some sort of substance abuse, right? Or suicide. So how do we create change? Well, we have to break the silence, right? We have to be willing to talk about what it means to be masculine in all the ways that that might be positive or negative. Same with femininity. And we need to form allies with people regardless of their position in the hegemonic system, right? So we cannot maintain that hegemony, right? Just surrounding ourselves with people who are just like us. And so I've shared some images on this slide just to show you some of the changes that we've already seen, right, in society, where we are more accepting of men showing other types of emotion, where we're more accepting of men, embodying a more feminine aesthetic, engaging in homosexual behavior, just being close with other men, regardless of what it says about your sexuality, right? These types of things. Okay, and so this leads us to Phil Petrie's paper, Real Men Don't Cry and Other Uncool Myths. So what I really love about this paper is not just that we're getting a first-person description of this from a man of color, but that he is writing this paper at a very important moment in his life. He and his wife are about to have what I think is their first child, right? So they're going to be new parents. And they're both experiencing a lot of anxiety about what this means. And so Petrie is using his paper as a way to sort of work out the issue he's having, because his wife wants to talk to him about these insecurities and anxieties that she's feeling. And he finds himself unable to meet her request. And he's struggling with why that is and what that means for their relationship going forward. Right? So he's talking here not just about the cultural roles, right, that he and other men have been placed in, but also what that means for what's being expected of them later on in life. So according to Petrie, right, being a quote-unquote man means being rational and objective, which is something that we're going to talk about in more detail when we get to epistemology in this class, but the basic idea is that a rational person makes decisions based on reason rather than emotion. And objective meaning that they are not biased towards subjective preferences. And so, again, what is implied by this is that being a man means being devoid of strong emotions. Strong emotions not only being associated with femininity here, but thus with being subjective and irrational. So the assumption, right, that we'll explore later is that if rationality and emotion are opposites of one another, well, then emotions are seen as getting in the way of being rational, right? So this is why we typically, when we associate emotions with women, we think that because of their emotions, they're unable to make reasonable decisions, right? And so this is a big problem that we're going to have to unpack, but he is mentioning it here briefly. And so as rationality and emotion, are seen as separate in this way, if being a man means being devoid of strong emotions, right, he sees this is described as being cool, right? So being cool is not like a trendy, you're wearing hip glasses and, the latest whatever brand of clothing, right? That's not the kind of cool he's talking about here. He's talking about being emotionless, right? So cool as in your demeanor, right? Not letting anything get to you. And so we have some different examples here on the bottom of how that sort of cool emotionalist masculinity has been embodied throughout the US, throughout recent history. And so what's the problem with this?